So my thought for these five weeks, right? That's how many weeks are in July. No, 4 weeks. Okay. That is less than I had in my brain. Okay. But no, I don't want to do that. I almost hit remove instead of admit. Okay. So my thought was for today, at least, we'll start with just like some overview. What is Talmud? How does Talmud study work? What does a traditional page look like? And then we could go on next week to looking at the first page of Talmud, like what most people would consider. I mean, the idea of like a beginning and end of Talmud is like a little arbitrary, but what most people would consider the first page that you start with when you study. And then we could either just like spend 3 weeks and go linear and see how far we get, or we could divide up the time between that and then like maybe spend the last class or the third class looking at something from the current track date where all the Daf Yomi folks are, and you could like kind of plug in a little bit to where the rest of world Jewry, like people who study Talmud in a kind of serious way, what they're looking at right now. And then, well, in my brain, when I thought there were 5 Sundays in June, I was thinking we could do 2 and 2. Now that I know we're only going to have 3 after this, I don't know how you feel about splitting between those 2 ideas.
Well, we don't mind going into a week of July. We could call it June.
Okay, then maybe we'll do that. Okay. Great. So today, to start with, what is Talmud? I guess I'm curious, before I give you like definitions, what is your awareness of Talmud? What if you had to define it for someone who really had no idea? What would you say?
Commentary on the Torah and all the history that's happened since then, I think.
Okay.
The postscripts as we go along.
Okay. Yeah, I would say the thing about it being a commentary on the Torah, I think that is a common belief, but it really it's more a commentary on what Jewish practice had evolved to in the end of the Second Temple and immediate post-Temple period. And then Torah verses were inserted in to justify what was happening. But it doesn't feel like they when you really read it mostly doesn't feel like they're starting with Torah and explaining out. It feels like they're starting with what has naturally evolved. And then they're going back to Torah to be like, see, this is like what was always supposed to happen.
Like in court, when lawyers use precedent.
Yes.
To justify.
Absolutely. Talmud is entirely case law. It's like, it is a lot of legal thinking, which is like why I think why a lot of lawyers are Jewish, or why a lot of Jews become lawyers. I mean, we have this stereotype that I think has to do with like people think it's more because, I mean, I'm sure these are factors too, but like the emphasis on learning in our culture, the concern of like not wanting to be a business owner because then when they kick us out, you can't take that career with you. Like these other reasons that like I feel like culturally people ascribe more to that connection of Jews and lawyers, but I really think it's because of the Talmud. It's like if you've spent any time in yeshiva or in like formal Jewish study, you already know how to read case law. So I don't really know how to read case law, but I feel like if I had to study it, I would pick up the logical pieces of it well because I understand Talmud. I might not be able, like learning legalese might be as hard as learning Aramaic, but at least the argumentation part would fall into place.
Because it's learned, right?
Right. So Aiden Steinsaltz, or Adin Steinsaltz, who was a contemporary, he just died like a year or two ago. He died sometime during this current Daf Yomi cycle. And it was like, you know, a big deal because this Daf Yomi cycle has been so universal in a way that has like never happened before. That so many people have joined in. Sorry, Debbie, were you gonna say something?
Dakiyomi?
Oh, Daf Yomi literally means a page a day. So it's this process of breaking down Talmud learning to a page a day. And historically, so the process of doing it for one page a day, as opposed to spending all day in yeshiva studying Talmud, is meant for people who also do have jobs. It's not necessarily meant for rabbis and yeshiva buchers, but it is like has traditionally been held by Orthodox people who have day jobs. Like it has traditionally still been men and men of a certain kind of Jewish observance and prerequisite learning. And over the last, I mean, obviously several like decades or whatever, it slowly has opened up more culturally to women, there are various classes that make it more accessible to people of less, halachic background and things like that. But really, when it takes about 7.5 years to get through the whole Talmud reading a page a day. And we'll talk in a little bit. I'll show you what a page of Talmud looks like if you haven't seen it. What I mean when I say a page, it's not what we think of as like a page in a book. So it takes about 7.5 years to get through the whole thing, the whole Talmud, reading a page a day. So it happens like on a set cycle, like many other things where in Judaism, where like the goal is to kind of keep people around the world, in our diasporic community linked. So there will be often, not often, there is like a big party, basically. It's called a siyum, like a concluding celebration in Israel and Jerusalem or Yavna, that area that's where a lot of yeshiva buchers are. So there will be a big celebration at the end of that 7.5 years for everyone to celebrate. And then they collectively know the next day we're all going to start again. So in January 2020, the new cycle started. And just, it really culminated with it being a new year, like a new Gregorian year, that it started in early January, that people were ready to take on a new project and have their New Year's resolutions. And then, of course, 2 months later, also people found themselves with a lot of time on their hands. So that helped. And then, also this cycle in particular, we're at a point where Judaism is open to a lot more people in general. There has been a lot more efforts to reclaim our own Jewish learning, that we can learn things that have historically been for the Orthodox or for men, and we can still learn about them without becoming Orthodox or without following a certain script of it. And the internet, just the ubiquity of things like Safaria and Zoom and all of these things just made it really accessible. So this cycle has been just hugely in the Jewish zeitgeist in a way that was not, it wasn't ever before January 2020. people who are Jewishly learned might know it existed, but like I know a ton of even rabbis older than me who like were already rabbis 7.5 years ago when it, they could have done the last, or I guess now 9.5 years ago when they could have done the last cycle, who didn't. Like this was just a big moment for whatever reason. So that also meant that a lot of people, including rabbis who maybe read Adin Steinsaltz in rabbinical school, but didn't necessarily like care, we had come to really depend on his really seminal work he's written commentary on the Talmud. The one I use now is not his, but the one I had to use in rabbinical school was his editing and commentary. He wrote a book called The Essential Talmud, which is like really, it's dense. I don't necessarily recommend it for like light reading to just understand an intro to the Talmud kind of thing. But if you did want to get seriously into Talmud learning, if you wanted to join Daf Yomi, it is like a great book to like understand the basic, again, those like legal argument, like things like prima facie and like terms that, I mean, they come up in Aramaic, they don't come up in Latin, but like that kind of concepts that like are logical rules or like formulas, he'll explain all those and kind of walk you through, as well as some of the history of how the Talmud came to be compiled and things like that. So he's like the 20th century Talmud guy. So his definition of Talmud is that it is the summary of oral law that evolved after centuries of scholarly effort by sages who lived in Palestine and Babylonia until the beginning of the Middle Ages. So in the where it starts is a little vague. The earliest named people in the Talmud are Hillel and Shammai. Often we refer to Rabbi Hillel. He wasn't really a rabbi. That title didn't exist yet. So like it's an anachronism. But he, like whatever, same thing, different name. But a lot of the concepts, like the concept of oral law, probably goes back as far as at least the first exile, from like the time of the prophets. That there are, again, these like sort of commentaries or use of Torah as justification for things that are naturally evolving, and the belief that it is Torah just like the Torah is Torah, that it is still part of oral law, that it was given to Moses at Mount Sinai by God, same as the tablets, and passed down orally, and maybe interpreted, but it's still the word of God. The first layer of Talmud is the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is, I meant to say when I said the earliest recorded names are Hillel and Shammai, they date to about 50 CE. So they lived even before the fall of the Second Temple, or they were teaching even before the fall of the Second Temple. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who does get the title rabbi, so he's slightly later, he is of the first generation. He is the first generation of rabbis that get to be called rabbis. He also lived through the destruction of Jerusalem from the Romans in 70 CE. There's a story in the Talmud of how his students smuggle him out in coffin. They claim he's already dead, and the Romans agree to let them bury him. And they smuggle him out and take him to Yavna, which then becomes the center of Jewish learning after Jerusalem is destroyed. So then from about 70 CE to the year 200 is the writing of the Mishnah in Yavna by these rabbis. And then between the year 200 and 500-ish is Gemara, which is commentary on the Mishnah. And that is happening in both Yavna, or around the land of Israel, as well as in Babylonia. And there's like 3 hotspots in Babylonia where Jewish communities were learning and writing and recording. And there's lots of stories of the Babylonian rabbis going to Israel and the Israeli rabbis going to Babylonia and learning from each other as well, but they are recorded separately. We follow the Babylonian Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud, as it's known, from the land of Israel, wasn't written in Jerusalem. Again, it's mostly Yavna. Jerusalem was destroyed, but we call it the Jerusalem Talmud. It either not as much was written, or a lot more was destroyed, or both, because of the Roman oppression. That in exile, the Babylonian rabbis were actually able to live more comfortably, openly Jewish, under like the Persian rule, and then living in the Holy Land under the Romans. Bless you, David. So we just have a lot more text in the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, and so that became the more authoritative one. But some scraps of the Jerusalem Talmud do still exist. You can still get some volumes translated into English, and they're mostly what does exist. There's a lot of, like, the tractates that exist in both formats are very, very similar. None of them are identical, but they, it's pretty similar. And there are a couple pieces that did survive in the Jerusalem Talmud that do not exist, like a couple of volumes, like maybe a whole tractate, or like significant pieces of tractate enough to make up their own book volume, that do not exist in the Talmud Bavli. So when we do Daf Yomi, I think it's Shekalim, one of the tractates that we do, and it's short. It only took about 3 weeks to get through in the Daf Yomi, but that was actually a Yerushalmi, and so it's just kind of interesting how that works out. But mostly we studied the Babylonian one. Now, also, so again, so we have the earliest recorded rabbis, or the earliest recorded names, are Hillel and Shammai from around 50 CE. And we know they were also mostly teaching, received wisdom as well. And then our final names in the Talmud date to about 500 CE, but there's clearly more editing that was done for at least another 200, maybe even up to 400 years after that, where there are layers of language that, I mean, to me, whatever, Aramaic is Aramaic, but that scholars like David Weiss Halivni, he was sort of the main guy that caught this, that there is this other several generations of editing where you can see some of the language shift in the unattributed arguments that and even sometimes in the attributed arguments, that the language is not the variation of Aramaic or Hebrew that rabbi would have spoken in the year that he lived. So somebody else put those words in his mouth. So the version that we have in all of its compilation and editing probably wasn't finished till about the year 800 or 900. That's still a long time ago, though, that then Jews have still been reading the same text for the last 1100 years or so. Okay, so I have some other definitions here. I have some timelines, but I've given you the basic breakdown. I want to show you what the page looks like. So this is an example. This is not Steinsaltz's page of Talmud. Yeah, this is, I think, it says following Steinsaltz. I think this is a page of Talmud example in Essential Talmud, but the ones that I had to use in rabbinical school, this part at the bottom would be Steinsaltz's modern Hebrew commentary. So you still have to know modern Hebrew and medieval French Hebrew and Aramaic to read it. There's a lot. I honestly, so this part, I don't know if you can really tell. These margins are in a different script of Hebrew. It's called Rashi Script. Rashi did not write in it. It's just for whatever reason. It's a slightly later medieval Hebrew script, and for whatever reason has, like, since the 14th or 15th century been the script that Rashi commentary in all Talmud volumes are written in, and it's awful. It's very hard to read, and I don't know why they make us do this. But so that's what's on the side. And so typically a page of Talmud, so this middle part, the margins are nice and clear. That's good, at least. This middle part is the Talmud page itself. One side will be Rashi, usually the side closest to the binding. And then one side will be someone else, often Tosafot, which is like Rashi's grandchildren, like the next generation of medieval French rabbis commenting on it. And then the bottom will be probably someone slightly more modern. So like I said, the ones that I had to learn from in rabbinical school was Adin Steinsaltz in modern Hebrew. The ones that I use now that are translated in English, it's the Koren publishers themselves put some notes on the bottom. So I think like some of the Vilna Gaon, or not Vilna Gaon, but the Vilna Shas, like the old school publications will have like Ramban or someone else, vaguely medieval, pre-enlightenment on the bottom. So always Rashi, almost always Tosafot, and then somebody else. There's usually a third, but the third is more likely to change. Within it itself, so this page doesn't necessarily tell us it's starting with Mishnah, which means it started on the previous page, the Mishnah teaching itself. But if you see here, these larger letters, the Gimel Mem, I don't know if you know Hebrew letters, but you can see that they're slightly larger here, where the arrow is pointing the 4. That means that's the start of the Gemara. So the previous paragraph here is Mishnah, and it's usually the Mishnah is in Hebrew, and then the Gemara is in Aramaic also, by the way. And so it'll be some piece, and it's not, I unfortunately don't have a copy of my Mishnah with me. But, the Mishnah you can get by itself. You cannot get Gemara by itself. There is no version of publication where you get Gemara on its own, because it wouldn't make sense. It's all commentary on Mishnah. And so they'll quote a piece of Mishnah. It's not like that the way that the Talmud as a whole is, where then Rashi's commentary is on the side. It's not like they'll have a whole passage of Mishnah and then Gemara commentary. It's like they'll quote a sentence or two, a passage, and then they'll argue about that passage for the rest of the page. And then here, where again the font is bigger, new Mishnah. Sometimes it picks back up where it left off, and it'll be like from the same, if you had a copy of the Mishnah on its own without Gemara, it'll be like the next sentence, but sometimes not. Sometimes it skips to a totally different tractate of Mishnah, but because the argument has still kind of led to this point, maybe not a whole different tractate, but a different section, because the argument has led to that point, they're going to pull a different verse or a different quotation from Mishnah. And then they'll argue about it again for another whole page, and so on. So that's the formula. Let's see. Then I wanted to show the chart. Yes. Okay. Okay. So Babylonian Talmud, Palestinian Talmud. That's also sometimes what it's called. The Jerusalem Talmud. So you see, these are the X indicates the tractate that they have, not that they don't have. That's odd because, because it doesn't. Okay, so the Palestinian Talmud has a lot of these tractates, but then none of this Seder. Sorry, there's a lot of, okay, so the thing also with Talmud is that a lot of the translations are not words that also mean much in English. It's like when we translate to fill in as phylacteries, like I don't know what phylacteries are. Like, that's not a helpful translation. So tractate is the volume itself. So I happen to have, hang on, let me pull this one. I was doing Daf Yomi for a while. I have fallen almost a whole year behind at this point, so I don't think it's fair to say I'm still doing a page a day. So this is the tractate that I fell behind on, that I'm still like hoping to, at my own pace, still finish the Talmud someday. So this is tractate Yoma, meaning, where's the, there, okay, there we go. It's hard to see. Yoma, which means, refers to Yom Kippur. So it's a tractate about Yom Kippur. So that's a tractate, like the volume, the book itself. Within a tractate or beyond a tractate, there are orders. So for example, in the Mishnah alone, because obviously it's a lot smaller since Talmud contains Mishnah and Gemara. So each Mishnah volume, there are only 6. When you buy a set of Mishnah, there are only 6 books because they contain these orders or sederim. So that's what these top categories are here. Within it, and some of these subcategories exist in the Mishnah, but they're like chapter headings because it's such a smaller segmentation. So you have 6 sederim, and then within each seder, there are the various tractates. So in the Gemara, because like then there's so much more material, every tractate becomes its own volume. Yeah, okay. I think that clears that up. So you can see that on the whole, it makes it actually look almost even, really, with all of these. I guess we just decided we don't care about these tractates because the Bavli became more seminal. I don't know what this third column of X's are either here, but anyway. So that's the Talmud. Okay. Let me pause. I can get like way into the weeds and nerd out about the construction of the Talmud, but let me see, what questions do you have so far? Is there too many? You're laughing, Debbie. Wait, you're muted.
The page that you showed us looked like it had, I mean, the side, the Hillel side was pretty clear. It was one column down, but the other side, it looked like the column was divided up and there was like an extra little piece.
Oh.
And is that all just other people's commentaries?
No, okay, so this very thin margin column is like citation type things or like footnotes.
Okay.
Not so much, not commentary. It's still, I mean, you could still kind of think of it as commentary, right? Like it helps fill in the gaps, but it's more editorial.
Okay.
And so it varies a little bit based on which publication you read. It's not like a rabbi the same way these other ones are like rabbinic commentaries.
Okay. And then you showed us this particular page had Hillel on
Rashi.
Right, but Rashi, but then other pages would have somebody else possibly, or it's always.
They pretty much always have Rashi. Let me see. Okay, so the thing that I like about this volume, this publication that I've been using, as opposed to the Steinsaltz ones that we used in school, is that it also has English. If I'm gonna just spend a little bit of time each day, I'm not gonna spend the 4 hours it takes to translate the page in Aramaic. So, yeah, okay. Is this the same? Oh no, okay. Yeah, so this is what it looks like in my book.
Okay.
Very similar. It's got more writing down at the bottom because it doesn't have the like explanatory note of this is an example page. Yeah, so the side in the closest to the margins is always Rashi. In this copy, the bottom one, it's the bottom one that's Tosafot, his grandson. Like I said, it's not as much of a given as Rashi, but it's very common. And then the third one is more likely to change. But I'm not sure who is the third one on this one. Let's see, does it tell me? I can't tell if it's telling me because it's tiny and in Rashi script on both sides. So rude. Anyway, and then the English is mostly just on the English side. This book mostly just gives the Koran publisher. That's just the publisher name. They are a Jewish Orthodox publication. I think out of England. They tend to be a little bit more literal than like Art Scroll has a very Hasidic bend to it. Koran is Orthodox, but not as agenda driven, maybe. So yeah, I like their stuff.
And then the Gemara and the Mishnah themselves were written by different authors, just depending on which.
Yes. So in the Mishnah and the Gemara itself, each section will have, I mean, it's hard to say who wrote it per se, because it's an edited compilation work. But it'll record the arguments of several rabbis and several generations of rabbis. Sometimes, often, like, it will record arguments between the same generation, and then it might say, like, you know, then somebody else disagreed, like of a later generation. But sometimes it will still also kind of write it as though these two men who lived 100 years apart were having the argument with each other, like talking to each other. And so, like, I don't know, it's just a fun little game to try to figure out what's really happening. And so that's the kind of stuff, that's where, like, the sign of, we call it the stam, which the word stam literally just means just. I mean, it's like a, it feels like it doesn't even fully translate exactly, but it's a thing that you would say for, like, just this thing and nothing else. Stam. But it has this, in Talmudic world, it has a meaning of anonymous. So there is a stam Mishnah that will sometimes conclude arguments in the Mishnah itself, but it is almost certainly Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi or one of his students. That's who is credited with compiling the Mishnah, with setting the order, and allowing it to be written down for the first time after 200 years of oral tradition. But in Talmud itself, in Gemara, but especially in how it's all woven together and what makes the Talmud, the stam is not just the anonymous voice that, like, ends the argument or, you know, helps lead from one piece into the next Mishnah or something. He's also the one, or they, I mean, again, it's probably several generations of rabbis that weave the different arguments together and do a lot of this, you know, cutting and pasting and assembling it in the way that it is, letting it read like a mostly coherent argument, as opposed to, you know, the hundreds of years apart. And in that, even though a lot of it's just cutting and pasting, in that weaving together, their own voice comes through. And that's where linguistic scholars were able to catch the differences of, like, layered language, and to be like, this is for sure not what this rabbi actually said. So I think that's fascinating. We don't know anything about the stam rabbis. It's a relatively recent, I mean, David Weiss Halivni was, I don't know, like the 80s or 90s, like maybe early 2000s, was doing this scholarship. So like this is very recent for him to point out that there are additional layers. Previously, people believed that Rav Ashi and Ravina are the two. They're like the final, like I said, the latest named people of the Talmud. In around 500. So people, for a very long time, the traditional belief in Talmud scholarship was that they closed it, is the term that's used, but like that they compiled it and like redacted it, sealed it the same way Rabbi Yehuda did for the Mishnah. And, like hundreds of years people have believed that, maybe 1,000 years people have believed that, until David Weiss Halivni, and then the next scholar, his successor is named Jeffrey Rubenstein. Actually, he's taken it up in a big way. And Tamar, oh, this makes me a bad feminist. I can't think of, there's a female scholar that also then took it up from Jeffrey Rubenstein, whose name I can't remember right now. But this like historical kind of piecing together how the Talmud was really compiled, because it clearly is, I mean, besides just the immense amount of like brain power that went into the arguments themselves, and the generations of rabbis that spent all of their time sitting around thinking about this stuff and arguing and studying the rabbis that came before them and all of that, the immense labor of then doing the editing and putting it together and making it in a time without like ubiquitous writing materials. Forget a printing press, like even pen and paper weren't super easy to come by, or quill and parchment or whatever weren't necessarily, like I said, ubiquitous. That they managed to do this, like, is just, it's enormous. And so obviously that invites its own set of questions as to how it really came together. And all of the unnamed scholars of the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th century that helped make that happen. And probably, I mean, some people even now are starting to question the narrative of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi too. I mean, the Mishnah is a much smaller scope, but now that we know what we believed about how the Talmud was closed is probably not true. Like maybe everything we assumed about how the whole thing was put together is not true, So yeah, that is that. So there are a few names that come up a lot in the Talmud. Hillel and Shammai. I feel like a lot of non-Orthodox Jews know who Hillel is, don't necessarily know who Shammai is. So, or don't know that name. So traditional, from the very, very beginning, traditional Talmud study is done in pairs. It was, or a Torah study for them. They didn't have the Talmud. They were creating the Talmud. But the study is done in pairs, and it's done in pairs that are not likely to agree with each other. That's an important piece, is that it is in the argumentation that revelation comes forth. So Hillel and Shammai are the first, we call them zug, couples. Not couples like romantically, but it's the same term that in modern Hebrew does mean a couple. I like it because in Hebrew script, the word zug kind of looks like a heart. The lamed and the Zion and the Gimel in script are like
Okay, yeah.
opposing faces to each other. They make a heart. So Hillel and Shammai are the first Zug. They disagree on everything. So you know the famous story about the would-be convert coming to Hillel and saying, so the first guy he comes to that says, go away, that's a ridiculous request, that's Shammai. So he has a reputation throughout the whole Mishnah, and after him as well, then like the study houses for the rest of all time is Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, like they're diametrically opposed schools of thought. And Shammai and Beit Shammai are always known for being stricter, more sticklers for halacha, more kind of gatekeepy in that way that story shows, whereas Hillel's default is always open-heartedness, meet people where they're at, love each other, like whatever helps you just like be a nicer person is how you should interpret the law always. So you can see why he became more popular, why his name stuck more. So they're the first two. A few others, Rabbi Yochanan, not the same one who got out of Jerusalem in a coffin, but another early generation of rabbis. There are a few things about Rabbi Yochanan, a few things that are said about a Rabbi Yochanan throughout the Talmud, slightly unclear if it's the same one, but the biggest like defining factor of him, besides being the greatest rabbi of his generation, is also that he's immensely beautiful. The Talmud tells us that a few times. So one day he's bathing in the river and a like gladiator bandit jumps in the river to steal him away because he thinks he's a woman. And Rabbi Yochanan says, I'm not a woman, but I do have a sister. She's just as beautiful as me. You can marry her if you become a rabbi. Strength fit for Torah is the phrase that they use for him. So he does. Reish Lakish like renounces his gladiator bandit ways. He comes to the study house. He becomes a devout person. He marries Rabbi Yochanan's sister. They are the next, maybe not the next Zug, but they are the prominent Zug of their generation. They argue a lot, but in ways that are important and challenging and useful. When they do have a terrible argument that breaks them up, and Rabbi Yochanan's next partner is too acquiescent. He's clearly a younger rabbi that somehow like won the lottery and got to be matched up with Rabbi Yochanan. So everything Rabbi Yochanan says, he says, yes, you're right. And Rabbi Yochanan's, what good are you? Like, you're supposed to push back. How can we ever reveal true Torah if all you ever do is agree with me? So he
got
gives
fired.
up. What?
He got fired.
He got fired. And then eventually Rabbi Yochanan dies of a broken heart because he misses Reish Lakish so much. So that's their story. Let's see, a few others. There are several big ones, but I'm going to skim this list and name the ones that I think you're most likely to hear. Oddly, Rabbi Akiba is not even on this list. He's a big deal. He like changes the game a little bit in terms of how Torah is interpreted. He is known for having much more like creative, interpretive commentary on Torah. And so again, like he's also early generation. He's actually, he might even be Mishna now that I think about it. So he's very early generation. He is, oh yeah, okay, I see now. What was I saying? Oh, since so much of, like I said, Talmud is about the evolution that's happening and then finding the Torah verse that fits, he is super good at that because he will find a way to make any Torah verse fit any situation. And he's like this genius at piecing it together. A lot of this is like his creativity and his being a little at odds against all of the other rabbis, not just his zug, but like even, others in his study house, is recorded, but it's also very well fleshed out in a fictional narrative called The Orchard, by Yochi Brandes. It's a Israeli book, but it's been translated into English. It's one of her two so far that have been translated into English. She's a best-selling author in Israel of several novels. But that's one of the two. And he's a very interesting character in that book. But a lot of it is based on real historical record. He also he was a supporter of the Bar Kokhba revolt. He believed that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah, so he had a little bit of that mystical bent to him as well, which not all of the rabbis at that time did. Like this is very pre-Kabbalah, so he's one of the first sort of mystical rabbis. He also is he's also well known for being the oldest rabbi to join the study house. He did not even know how to read or write until the age of 40, which at that time, 40 is like old. So but he proves his clever thinking to this woman who is the daughter of a very wealthy man and a very devout Jew, although her father's not a scholar or rabbi or anything, but he supports the study houses. And so she marries Akiva and gets her father to pay for him to be able to go to the study house, and he becomes this great rabbi. So that's important, that elevates him. Let's see. Other big names. Those are, I guess Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, I told you, is known for being the one to conclude the Mishnah, and Ravina and Rav Ashi are important for being considered the two to close the Gemara. Although being the latest, their names actually don't come up that much. Like, other than that, they are the final generation and that they did for 1,000 years have this credit of being the last Talmudic rabbis and having, the duty to compile and edit. They're not, at least from the sections I've read, I have not finished the whole Talmud yet, but from the sections I've read, they are not the biggest names to come up, but they're significant. Yeah. And then there are some names that feel like they repeat. So it's important to notice the variations. There are, first of all, because a lot of rabbis were the sons of rabbis. So you'll have so-and-so, Ben, so-and-so, you already know the first rabbi, like, Rabbi Gamliel then had a son named Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. And every time in the Talmud, it gives us his whole name. And so you're like, oh, Gamliel, I know that guy. It's not the same one. It's Ben Gamliel. And then there is like Ben Zoma and Ben, they're not listed here, but there are a couple, we don't even get their first names, right? Because Ben is not their first name. Then it would say Benjamin, right? It's not a nickname, it's son of. but we don't get their first names for whatever reason. And so like that can get confusing. There is a Rava, a Rabbah, and a Ravina, which can get confusing. Plus, in the Aramaic, all of the names, all of the Aramaic for rabbi is Rav, and the Hebrew for rabbi is Rabbi. Rabbi is an anglicized version. In modern Hebrew now, we do actually use Rav because the Babylonian tradition outlived the Palestinian tradition of that time period. But in the Mishnah, all of that, those early generations of rabbis they have a yud at the end of their phrasing, and the Aramaic ones don't. So that also helps a little bit when we have another Rabbi Yehuda and a couple Rabbi Yochanans and things like that. But one is Rabbi and one is Rav. So things like that will be they can trip you up when you are trying to read like a lot. I don't know how much of those names we're going to encounter if we only get through it a little bit, but we'll see. That's something to look out for. So the one last thing I do want to clarify before we go, and so what we'll see in the next hopefully 4 weeks then is so Daf Yomi refers to, first of all, not even just the page like I showed you, but a front and back like that. So technically already that's 2 pages. So Daf, in modern Hebrew, it's still, well, no, actually not in modern Hebrew, Amud meets page. So Daf is like the sheaf of paper itself. So it's 2 pages. But because of Hebrew or Aramaic is a very dense language, all of your pronouns and prepositions are just prefixes and suffixes. They're not their own words. So, and Talmud makes a lot of assumptions about what you already know. So it will use an acronym to mean a whole Torah verse or something. So when you look at it in the English and you have those gaps filled in, a daf is 5 to 10 pages. So that's something to be aware of, that if we spend an hour next week looking at the first daf of brachot, of blessings, it's about the Shema. So that's one of the reasons why it's always the first, because it's a thing if you're going to learn Talmud, you know what the Shema is. It's a prayer that we say twice a day, theoretically, morning and evening, last words on your breath when you die. The basics of what the Shema means in Judaism. So it's a good starting point, right? But it'll take us the full hour to get through the page, and we might not even get through the whole page. So it's just something to be aware of, that it's not light reading when you say a page a day. You're muted again, Debbie. I didn't catch that.
I said, I kind of think I knew that it wouldn't be light reading.
Okay. So
but that does sound like a good play, that would give us a good feel for what we're trying to do, I think, because it is something we're familiar with, but to find out why you can study the Shema for a whole hour and more.
Yeah.
I think is a good place to start.
Okay, excellent. So that's where we will start next week then. And we'll kind of feel it out from there. All right. Oh, and blessings to you, Lamar. Have a good week, everyone.
Quick
Oh,
question.
yeah.
It has nothing to do with Talmud exactly, but when you say yeshiva bucher,
Yes.
is that something that you can call a yeshiva bucher to his face? Or is that, my mother used that term a lot, and well, not a lot, but whenever she used it, it was pejorative. It really was.
Oh, it's not, I wouldn't say, okay, so bucher, has connotations of a young man, of a boy. So
Okay.
we say in the non-yeshiva world, we tend to apply it to anyone who's been to yeshiva, anyone who studies this kind of stuff, who's Orthodox, who doesn't like have a day job kind of stuff.
Okay.
And so that would be probably insulting to a grown man who does that.
Okay.
The term itself is not pejorative. Like if you say it to a schoolboy, it's like that is what they are.
He is.
But you know, like they outgrow that term by somewhere between 13 and 18. I'm not sure exactly where the line is in that community, but you don't say it to a grown man.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Bye, everyone.